Всем привет, это проект
Hello everybody, this is Project Alpha. My name is Nikolai Feldman and you're watching War Diary Live with Alexey Arestovich. Hello Alexey. Hello everybody, my name is Alexey Arestovich. Alexey, you're in a good mood today. I actually planned a lot of things to bring up today and you're starting with jokes. Oh, sure, please. Go ahead. I apologize, Kolya, I will not do it again. We talk about Ukraine, right? So I gotta maintain the pose and the face. Okay. So first of all, let's say that there have been a lot of things mentioned about Putin's need to make sure Trump preserves his face during the negotiations. And you did mention that the children in Ukraine would not be reflecting in a good way on President Trump's efforts. And we do have pretty bad statistics on the kids' deaths here in Ukraine. So do you think it affects Trump at all, in your estimation? Nikolai, it is a strong hit because it's much more difficult for Trump to explain what does he call Putin a good fellow, and he still negotiates with him. He avoided going into this topic. Trump said that the civilians continue dying and this is not good. And the ambassador reacted stronger. That chain happened on the very minimum of communication, at the bottom of a signal, but people understood what was sent to Putin. Today Putin, or I think Dmitriev, mentioned that, or reaffirmed, that Vladimir Putin, or one of his talking heads, confirmed also that Putin is not against ceasefire, but there are some nuances. And this is acknowledgement of the fact that Russian missile killed Ukrainian kids, and in Russian social media there was a wave of regret about deaths of kids, even though there was in parallel a different wave about them targeting a bunch of NATO generals who were somehow visiting this kid's playground. But in Russia, they don't have telemarathon like we do in Ukraine, so even under Putin, they have a couple of different opinions. Still, this was indeed noticed. This indeed was an event that caused and made people react to that directly. They could not name the trouble directly because it would have hung the negotiations, but they were forced to react to that. It's similar to what's happening with tariffs, by the way, which when Trump was asked why did he not slap tariffs on Russia, because they are negotiating with Russia about the war. And you slap sanctions when negotiations fall through. So the analogy, I would say, is as follows. We would not spoil the things by naming them as they are, although everybody does understand the events, circumstances, and dire consequences. All right, Alexei, another question about red lines. Seems like the strikes of Russian Federation on Krivoy Rog in Ukraine were crossing some of those red lines that were commented earlier in regards to negotiations on ceasefire. So, in the results of negotiations with Rubio and Callas, that United States, Callas mentioned that, not Rubio, that United States will not cross red lines that violate terms of Ukraine. Regardless, you did mention in previous streams that the only red line that Ukraine has is the quantity of Ukrainian troops in peace times, and Russian Federation does not put it in the corner of negotiations. From what was voiced as a result of these negotiations, Nikolai, it was 250,000. 250,000 is good enough for Ukraine. Those people who are talking and commenting that Ukraine needs to have 1 million people under arms in peace times, this is horrible because we cannot pay for so many people taken out of work and just guarding our borders. 250,000 is optimal. We can provide enough regular training, enough training for quality reserve to be rotated and created as a result of this 250,000 army. And this is good enough quantity, numbers, to hold our borders. Minimal quantity is the number that is enough to hold your borders in peace times. Even Soviet Union had the grid for that. And of course, it depends upon the real threats, and we understand that we could use 500,000 army. And some people are commenting that special forces may be playing a bigger role. And no, you cannot use special forces for all terms and all needs of your army. Quantity is still important. As Stalin said, quantity is quality in itself. United States are not being threatened by Mexico or Canada, but they still have about 2 million troops in peacetime. So we in Ukraine should also follow the same principle of necessary and enough, and 250,000 is a good enough number. Previously, Russians were demanding 50, 70, 80,000. We cannot fully acknowledge that it is indeed 250,000 there, but this number was floated as the result of these negotiations. I cannot remember who exactly, but I think it was somebody from the Trump camp who mentioned that when they were commenting on Putin's needs and requirements, that he wants elections in Ukraine under guidance of United Nations, and that the army in Ukraine cannot exceed 250,000. But that's okay. That's a red line that we can agree on. I'll say one more scary thing now, but I'm a specialist in saying scary things. The rest of the demands of Putin are basically could be interpreted as demands to Ukraine's constitution. Perhaps outside of the Russia's acquisition of the territories that they want to acquire as a result of this. We were not planning on giving them to them. But as for language and rights, civil rights of different groups and ethnicities in Ukraine, this is in our constitution. Alexey, could there be other red lines that they could have discussed with Rubio? Well, Nikolai, what is a red line, technically? Imagine Ukraine putting up 700-page documents denoting the red lines, explaining that we cannot cross them. And then if they call to the country that is supporting them, which is United States would ask them, okay, those red lines, are you eager, are you capable to defend these demands, or do we have to step in for you in order for you to get them? And that's what is a red line, right? Red line is something that the one who wants to violate that would think about 3 times before violating because of the consequences. Can we provide any consequences to Putin? Right? The answer to this question determines how real are our red lines. You can draw a lot of red lines with your red pencil. You can pray send asanas to your pencil, but from a lot of gibberish birthed by information politics of this war, only 2 are complete idiocies. One is red lines, another is guarantees of security, so-called. I also like that statement with the addition of real security guarantees, because there is only one real security guarantee, which is readiness to fight on the side of Ukraine against Russian Federation. And even that does not really guarantee you security. It only guarantees you will have an ally who will fight with you together. It's not security. This is not a security guarantee. This is just another ally. So people divided into 2 camps. One of them allow themselves to be fooled and eat all that is given to them, and the others don't really. And those who don't fall for all this treachery, they usually watch our war diaries here. All right, Alexey, we also perhaps add some people to the camp of those who don't watch us, but I think they may also have some logic. These are the people talking about placing peacekeepers in Ukraine. I paid attention to the president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, who played golf with Trump and generally became rather loyal to Trump and his politics pretty quickly. And here he said the following: regardless of activization of possible placement of foreign troops on the Ukraine territory, right now it's not a good time to discuss placement of peacekeepers in Ukraine. And he said that in his interview to Die Welt publication in Germany, and the topic is becoming more symbolic and is disconnected from reality. And this was happening on the background of President Zelensky conducting big negotiations with President of France and Germany on this topic, while President of Finland is saying that this topic is really not real. Look, Nikolai, that's why Putin, Chinese, and Trump do not consider Europe to be a factor in these negotiations. They see that these guys are absolutely not serious. All these visits of the bosses and the heads of central commands, this is just imitation of Europe having some position, any position in this regard. Perhaps they do have a position. Maybe it's not rhetoric. Maybe it is a position. But how are they going to provide for these promises? Right now, we do not have an answer. What will happen if Russian missile hits the headquarters of French peacekeepers in Ukraine? As long as we don't have an answer, that means nothing. When Macron, in a beautiful pose that he had trained before the mirror for hours, is addressing his nation, saying that we need to take part in this process, and his admiring nation is looking at him with big eyes, but forgetting to ask a question. Dear President, dear Supreme Commander, what happens if Russians kill a French soldier? Do we start war with Russia? Do we do the parity answer and shoot one of theirs? Or do we kill 100 of them? Or do we shoot at Moscow? Or are we bringing our nuclear arsenal into readiness? What will France do? Until there is an answer, all these visits by chiefs of staff, heads of military command, or even their whole army is about nothing. Trump knows that, Putin knows that, Xi Jinping understands that. Because, and for the reason that these three, and the Houthis and Israel, and maybe Iran and Turkey, with Azerbaijan, not too many countries who are aware of that. These are the countries who are ready to support their politics at the highest level. They're ready to pay their bill on the highest level. If they need to engage in hot warfare with their opponent, they will. But when you know that you're not going to fight and you're just talking without supplying any material resources to these ideas, then you are just a blabber. Even if you're president of France or a commissioner of security in EU, your cost is nothing. And that's why none from Europe was taken to the table to negotiate that big Yalta 2.0 that started a while ago. There are only Americans, Russians, and Chinese at this table. That's why Trump is making reserved compliments to Putin, not because he is an agent, but because he is dealing with real force. And by the way, North Korea is also a real force, and he does give nods and compliments to the leader of that country. He understands that these countries will have no reservations about shooting. And Trump knows that he has no reservations to retaliate and shoot back. That's why he is taking this position. And that's why he's also accepting Netanyahu in the United States, regardless of the arrest orders in Europe. And that's why Orban received him, even though he should have probably arrested him. But Orban is on orbit. Rather poetically, he is in Trump's orbit, and he knows that he should not be afraid of anything. A lot of people are saying that the holy world of democrats is destroyed with US aid and LGBTQ, and the world fell back to the bloody original state. I wrote a post today that the world did not return back to the right of the mighty. It returned back to the right of the capable. If you're capable, people will consider you. Countries have to consider Houthis, even though those guys in flip-flops running around and shooting random missiles at some vessels passing on the canal. People do have to consider them. And if you're incapable of any strong answer, then regardless whether you have Louvre, Rheinmetall is in your country, and you manufacture military equipment, Nobody cares about your opinion. Not until you're ready to shoot somebody between the eyes who crossed your red line. When you, for example, are in Texas and states, you can see some of these red lines and you can feel them. And you don't need to declare things. You do not need pretty statements in front of nations. You walk on the street and you understand that a lot of people on the street can pull out their gun and shoot you if you cause ruckus. But everybody understands that everybody can pull against him too, and that's why people are polite, owning their space, and relaxed. As somebody said, Alexey, democracy is the world of armed gentlemen, right? Exactly, Nikolai. Because those armed gentlemen created the democratic procedures only because they were dangerous to others. And when democracy turned into some fat-free yogurt, these procedures became stones that are drowning it. When they started paying too much attention to the emotionally hurt and offended. When the original democracy was the form where people were standing shoulder to shoulder defending their values in their townships. Americans understood that while being armed, they need to have a very strong society. Otherwise, it'll be difficult to coexist. And that's why they do have the laws and they do have the freedoms. But there is a good also Eastern proverb. The one who has musk in your pocket, you do not scream about that and yell about that on the square. The smile tells for it. Europeans got contaminated with the Ukrainian disease. A lot of videos, a lot of words, a lot of blabbering without having any force to back it up. And without even having firmness of intention, even capability to do it. That's why Europe today, with all the nuclear British and French arms, is weaker than Houthis. And that's it. That's why, because of that, it is not being considered. And when Ukraine pays them visit, or they pay visit to Ukraine, press, of course, comments that, oh, this is a great event. France is with us, Britain is with us. This is all a very blatant deceit of Ukrainian population that is tortured by this war, who are still losing their kids because of this war. And our dear government in Ukraine continues to paste that false signal on top of this, basically continues to lie. And instead of treating and healing people with truth, they start pouring lukewarm water of compassion. And that continues to repeat over and over again after each strike. And nobody wants to acknowledge that Europe purchased more oil and gas from Russian Federation for worth more than they have funded Ukraine's defense against Russian aggression. This is from French and British money. Russian missiles and Russian UAVs are paid for with this money that Europe paid Russia for the energy. This is all paid from European money. And until we acknowledge this fact, and until we show them that we understand it, and that, guys, let's talk in real terms and not about these fantasies. Mutual assurities about the pink yogurt. This is about nothing. This is not serious politics. All right, let's clarify here one more thing, Alexey. Am I right understanding that your message is that only condition for security of Ukraine and guaranteeing some red lines of Ukraine is capability to hit your enemy with a parity strike? No, not parity, Nikolai. Well, okay, maybe I misspoke, but some kind of memorable or painful strike. Is that what you imply? You know, Nikolai, there are guys called Gurkhas. There are Nepalese mountain people who are considered to be good soldiers. British Army has the whole battalion of them. I am failing to draw the year when it happened. Was it 19 or 20 or... But the legend says that it did happen when the British embassy was evacuated, or there was another hustle. there was about 1,500 mujahids approaching British embassy, getting ready to destroy them. And there were only 2 or 3 Gurkhas defending it. So they came out, they took out their knives with the insignia of Shiva on them. They originate from the Greek kohis, that's a small, shortened Greek sword. And Alexander the Great warriors brought those weapons over to those lands back in the day. So there were, I'm failing to remember, 3 or 5, but they went against those 1,500 with their knives. Of course, they all perished, but they used their sanctions. They used what they had to fight against, and they are a factor. These people are considered. But when you have nuclear arms like France, but you cannot give an answer whether you will shoot back if Russia kills a French soldier, you can have 10 times more nukes. Nobody would care about it. It's about nothing. War is the trumping card. And if somebody wants to kill you, what matters is your capability to retaliate back with equal or stronger force. And instead of bringing up our people as a nation of hunters, and our people need to be actually in a higher level than hunters. We need to be hunters for hunters, because Russians are not so dumb. They are treacherous and stubborn enemies. And in order to fight and resist them while being a minority, we need to be not just hunters, we need to be hunters of hunters. And unfortunately, our central signal in Kiev is making everybody a victim and making everybody a jello that absolutely loves when they get some warm pink drip attached to their veins. And it's just surprising that not all of our citizens are completely weak, because 6 years, with 3 recent years being most stern of such propaganda, and we still have some people who are resisting it. We need to be merciless as the northern wind and cunning as the Middle Eastern curved sword. And it starts with us stopping to lie to ourselves and stop believing in those sweetened fairy tales from Macron and British that they'll come here and bring some peacekeepers. We do not need to sit there with them in the cabinet and smile. We need to be asking them hard questions. Monsieur Macron, if a French soldier is murdered on the border or on Ukrainian territory by Russians, what will you do? Until you're ready to answer this question, we can talk about your art, about your kitchen in France, about your wines, but we cannot talk about your army if you don't know an answer to whether you will attack back if you lose your soldier. French army is not a factor. It doesn't exist until it's ready to shoot back. Why am I asking about this right and capability to retaliate, to provide a parity force? I'm remembering a historic event such as Dresden bombardment, which happened, and I think one can say it was a big changing factor when Britain and allies bombed that city. In the logic that currently follows these negotiations, when Putin is trying to place a responsive ultimatum to Trump to counter his ultimatum, and Ukraine is taking a position of victim, and in many cities of Ukraine there's a lot of mourning about kids that died in Krivoy Rog. Do you think it would be an adequate action to attack Russian cities, Russian townships, that would lead to similar effects? Could we exercise that? Of course not, Nikolai. Why? Well, if they are shooting up our civilians, why cannot we do that, right? We're following our media and we're saying we cannot be neutral to Russia. And understandably, we're not discussing any friendly formats. We're not even neutral to them in the current state, or in the future possible state. But de facto, if we want to stop this war, we need to be strong enough, and we need to exercise parity and very unparalleled efforts on Russia. in order to make them stop and think next time. Have you watched the movie The Predator? Oh yeah, I've seen that, Alexey. Whom did he not fight with, Nikolai? He is an archetypical hunter. He was tearing the spinal cords together with heads of those who were fighting with him. Whom did he not kill? The unarmed. And the movie doesn't even talk about kids and women. In the second Predator, I think there is an episode when the policewoman is shooting him. He grabs her and scans her and sees that she's pregnant, and he lets her go. Well, she just shot him. If we're talking about having an army that is capable to hold 2,500 kilometers of border with Russia, we cannot be fighting with women and children. We cannot use the bodies of Russian soldiers as an alphabet to write some messages on the snow. We cannot shoot up Belgrade aimlessly and tell them that this is for you for Krivoy Rog attack and all that BS. We need to educate ourselves and prepare ourselves to be people who can finish the most serious and strongest opponent who is attacking us and who is killing our women and children. We should not be attacking their women and children. We should be hunting their hunters. This is the society that we need to train and educate. Because when you start going into that dark frame of, we'll kill your kids if you kill ours, war is a dirty thing. When we're attacking warehouses near Engels, when our UAVs are flying to Moscow. Well, Alexey, sorry for interrupting you. I don't think there's going to be kids in the oil refinery, right? Well, Nikolai, when the roof goes away or the windows get blown out, when people were cheering when Engels was destroyed, some of these shards can cut some kids and maybe cause irreparable harm. So we should not be marking them as targets. This is not something to cheer. This is not something to go for. I don't want to have anything in common with people who are saying, let's kill theirs if they kill ours, civilians and women and children. With people who are thinking, okay, what do we do that they would stop killing our civilians forever and never do it again? These people I can talk to. These people we can have some values, shared values. But the first ones, I don't want to be on the same square mile of space with them. And yeah, no, this question is not to me about killing their civilians as retaliation for ours. No, this is low and ineffective. Well, this position is on the agenda in Ukraine, Alexey. A regular Ukrainian often thinks that Trump is talking to Putin regardless of Putin shooting up Ukrainian kids. And Putin is also trying to bind Trump with his own ultimatum, pushing back on Trump's demands. And Trump understands that and goes to negotiate and continue talking to him and negotiate with him in that global Yalta agreement, because Russia is a subject, Russia is a big territory, big resource, and it's definitely a force in the world arena. And the main thing that Ukrainian citizen, without thinking deep, will say, well, probably killing our civilians is part of what makes Putin strong. And the reverse logic, what they exercise very often is, in order for us to exercise and be strong, we need to basically do the same thing that Russia does. And that's why I'm asking this question, because this troubles some Ukrainian circles, and people are discussing that. Well, and you did mention in other streams that French in Algeria have killed a lot of civilians. British did that too, and Americans had some dark episodes in Vietnam. You did bring those examples. Maybe the world is like this. Maybe we misunderstand something about this world. Well, Nikolai, definitely world is pretty dark. What Ukrainians fail to understand is that when they bring this bill to France and Britain and the United States that Russians have killed our children, we cannot negotiate with them and we need to bomb them to smithereens. What do French, Brits and Americans hear? They hear that Ukrainians have not opened the world history book ever. They don't want to use the collective experience of humankind. They do not know that Americans in Vietnam have killed several tens of thousands of civilians in Vietnam, including some with defoliation agents and other chemicals, and there were a lot of mutations and consequences. That French also caused a lot of damage and casualties in Algeria. And Brits were the ones who came up with the idea to bomb German cities because and the civilians in those cities, because they were going after idea that German soldier in a trench needs to think not about how to shoot another opponent's tank, but that his wife and children are probably suffering back in the city, back at home. And Soviet Union caused huge harm to Afghanistan. And there were at least several hundred kids there among them. And Ukraine was part of Soviet Union at that time, right? This is the ugly face of war, that civilians and children do die. When Americans blow up the Houthis, do you think there were also maybe accidental children victims there? And when Europeans made mistaken or erroneous attacks in Afghanistan, the moment there is a wedding there and people are shooting up in the air, the jet takes off and blows up the whole wedding. And these things happen at war. And all these countries who have committed quite a few of the darker war episodes, they hear from Ukrainians that you cannot deal with those who are doing that, with Russians who, as a collateral damage, has children in Ukraine. They understand that Ukraine is not on the same page with them. Our humanity is pretty dark. There are a lot of casualties among civilians every time there is a warfare. And humanity had actually resolved a way to solve these issues. And if Russians were a bit smarter, I don't think they will, because it's because of the way the politics currently work. But if they were smarter, they would actually compensate Ukrainian families for the deaths of the children. The rules of war allow for that. Americans, when they have destroyed the wedding, they actually went in and paid money to the relatives for the destruction. And that's when we initially hit Belgorod and accidentally killed some of the Russian children on the ice rink. I did say that the best thing Ukraine can do now is acknowledge that and pay reparations to the relatives of the families who lost their children and relatives. That would have been a sign to our allies and supporting countries that Ukraine now has some moral authority and is a stronger country than what they think of us now. And when we come to them and say we cannot agree, we cannot sign anything with those who kill civilians, well, that's a wrong message we're sending. And then same people come out and say, we need to bring back the nukes to Ukraine. And the partner is looking at us and saying, well, you are insane, guys. You cannot solve the simplest moral dilemma that was resolved by humanity a while ago. You're failing to address the collective experience of humanity, and you're not thinking about anything but taking that plate of pink jello with Macron's snot and put it on your face. They do not consider us to be a serious partner. They're looking at us thinking, did they not know that civilians die in war? What nukes? What stabilization fund? In kindergarten, they do have leashes where they put little kids on, a year and a half ones, the ones who cannot walk on their own. If there is only one teacher, they tie them all together with the same leash. And they see Ukrainians as these kids. How do you think they can deal with us on the rare earth minerals? Every day there are people dying in this war. Every day there are children and civilians dying. When Hamas attacked Israel, they did a bunch of atrocities, right? The recent story about how they killed two brothers so that Israelis would not get to them when they started the liberation process. And then they tried to present as if Israeli bomb killed them. This is how the world works, unfortunately. This world was similar when Biden was running United States, or whoever was behind him. It's just that they were pouring the strawberry jam over everything and pretending everything is hunky-dory, and now they don't. And it's us, Ukrainian, who are choosing to take that weak position when we choose to support Zelensky. Each morning, Ukrainian is choosing whether he'll be the person from thinking of whom Russian soldiers will wake up in a nightmare, or will they be that weak neighbor who's always the perpetual victim? And when people suffer, where do they look? Of course, they look at the central command, central power, and dealers of public opinion. And unfortunately, they're all expressing the similar points in Ukraine because they're either afraid or wrong motivation is driving them. And our authorities, I don't know whether some of the stand-up comedy or some other experience is talking here, but they're sending that really sentimental signal. Oh, our kids suffered as the result of this attack. Russia needs to be destroyed with nukes in its entirety as the response. And then Americans are probably looking at that thinking, well, yesterday when we blew up Houthis, there probably were some children there. Is Ukrainian society going to ask us to shoot ourselves up as well, if that comes to light? And they also aspire to be the factor in the global politics with these views, looking at Ukraine and thinking of them. So, sadly, this weakness that our society currently reveals, it affects the destinies of our children and their children. Trump is 78, but he's concerned about our children dying on this war. But no, Ukraine wants nukes. Ukraine wants to destroy Kremlin as an answer for this attack, or shoot up their cities and their civilians as a retaliation. This is the mentally disabled way of thinking. I understand when some PR starving YouTube channel is talking about it, but when our leading politicians are discussing that, what are we talking about? Brings to mind the phrase that Vladimir Lenin said back in the day: in autocratic countries where the crowd is ruling, the leaders are never anybody but the crowd. They're just the sum of all the moods in the crowd. We have a mirror story here. We have a guy from the people ruling us in Ukraine, literally. He's not one of the elites. He's one of us. And our authorities here, they appeal to some of the lowest instincts in the society, while also on the TV marathon we're talking about the highest moral compass that we have, and that will teach the whole country, the whole world. And unfortunately, we do not even have enough energy to separate screamingly incompatible things. Because right now we're talking about destinies, okay, probably just Ukrainians, millions of kids, future citizens, for several dozen years ahead. And a responsible politician cannot be dealing in this. He cannot be dealing with the lives of their citizens and children in such fashion because he's thinking about future. That is what politicians should be doing. While in Ukraine, a politician is the father of the family with a lot of kids who has mortgage and credits and everything else, with sick parents, and he imagined that he lost everything in casino. And then he comes home and says, well, we have no money and we cannot even afford the house. And when the family asks him, Dad, why? He says, well, hang on here. I was very honest. I invested my whole soul into my game. Nobody can tell me I was immoral. I was fitting my morals and everything is great. But in our case, it also will be false because that dad, in our case, also stole some money from the family to play in the casino. He was not even authorized to use that. And then they talk morals when they're caught with their pants down with the corruption. I cannot even pick the right word. This is just such a low rank method of behavior that it's not even the lowest of inmates in their categories. Because our leadership flushed everything down the toilet, and when they're caught with their pants down, they start talking about morals. I don't even know how to characterize them. This is pretty low. And then we get surprised, why do countries treat us the way they do? Because that's the signal we emanate, that they can. And it's okay to treat us this way. And a lot of this responsibility is on our authorities. To some degree, I can understand responsibility on the parents, on those who lost their kids in that playground. I understand that they're going through grief. But the dealers of public opinion, if you are a power representative of centralized power, you have some responsibility. And instead of raising the ethics of your people, you are lowering it. I think there is a special place in hell for people like this. But until they get there, it may take some time. This road, unfortunately, leads Ukraine to be isolated from the world community, world at large. Because Americans and the others who kill civilians with bombings when they have to bomb the enemy, they look at Ukrainian appeals and think that you guys are inadequate. Nikolai, that society that we have, societal screams on social media and on TV in Ukraine, that they need to retaliate Russia in the same fashion. And they're saying that the real Trump and not the fake one who was made in Moscow in somewhere in the 70s, the real Trump would have blown up Moscow as a retaliation. When I would just pose a adequate question here. When we accidentally kill their civilians, does Russia have to attack us with nukes? Well, of course not. Right, Nikolai. Because then we use a different argument. Oh, we are being attacked. We are the victim in this war, so we can do anything. This is the very low rank behavior. I like this term, right? It's very delicate term to avoid using the expletives, but this is a very low rank behavior that our authorities currently display. Yeah, they started first, basically. That's kindergarten. I'm sorry, I'm barely picking up words. I'm in the mood to use some expletives here. All right. Generally, Ukraine is refusing to denounce their illusions about Europe. And I wonder what can lead us to understanding that some of this is fake. We will have on the 11th of April Rammstein, and I think Hexeth refused to fly, and it'll be driven by Germany and Great Britain. And I think this Rammstein will be a signal to Ukraine. What will Europe do without United States? In your view, what can Europe do without US? Because here in Ukraine, we have some victorious relations being spread around in the media saying that United States are crawling back to their continent and Europe is now taking their place with counting the billions of euros that will be designated for Ukraine. What do you expect personally from Rammstein without United States? I expect nothing, Nikolai. A lot of empty words, talks about millions of shells, hundreds of thousands of drones, hundreds of billions of aid, which will never come. As the result, they'll probably give us a couple billions of euros, maybe some shells, and maybe they'll give us 30 APC vehicles and maybe 500 or 1,000 aerial bombs. These are the things that we'll spend in less than a week on this war, not even to the next Rammstein. Europe is not in a state where they can replace military aid coming from the United States, and they will not be in this state for another 5 years at least, even if they drop all they're doing now and switch to mobilizing their military industrial complex. Maybe in 5 years they'll be somewhat equivalent. But in Ukraine, they'll talk about any aid we get, that if we get 60 APCs from Sweden or somewhere, that they'll help us take Siberia and then Vladivostok in Russia. That's how it will be presented, right? What Ukrainians fail to understand, not because they're in Ukraine physically, but because a lot of things are messed up in their minds. The central signal is really effing them up. That we are in a very essentially simple situation. The situation is extremely simple. You are being directly lied to by your leadership. And these lies are not for your good. And it's not like disinformation where 90% of truth and 10 is some falsities, just to accommodate for the fog of war. No, it's a direct change of signal, 180 degrees. Instead of coming out and saying that aid from Europe is shitty, that we're thankful for this, but it cannot really help us to solve any problem. It cannot even last from one Rammstein to another. Instead, this is being presented as heavenly saving moment, and that Europe had replaced the United States. I'll repeat what I said yesterday in a stream with Romanenko, that the main donor of security for Europe is the United States. Europe is failing to pull their own weight. Land army of Britain is 73,000. Russians attacking only on Pokrov's direction by 150,000, over than 2 times more than the entire British army of infantry. And I talked to some friends in Britain who were brought up in no warm attitude towards the United States. Their grandfathers were not fans of the United States. And these people occupy rather high positions now in Britain. They hate the United States, they hate Donald Trump, yet they still acknowledge that without the United States, we'll be done with. And Britain is not Ukraine. Britain has nukes. Britain has $1.5 trillion of the annual budget. And they're an island, which one needs to cross the canal to get to them. And I'll repeat yesterday's thought. Remember the Zelensky's revolt, the ending of this, in the Oval Office? He was almost propped up to the position of the leader of European anti-American coalition. But next day, all the handshaking, even with the king, ended with them pointing in direction of the United States and telling him to go make friends again. Then there was a meeting in Brussels, and it ended in the same fashion, that you need to go and make peace with Trump. While we are trying, on this basis, to build our government politics, that is solving the matters of survival or not survival of Ukraine. Who are we after that? Who are we and how do you treat us? What attitude can we demand towards us? It's always the person who is setting his own price. If people who have issues with their image, with their past, but they see how their partner is lying instead of just acknowledging truth, they can see the true value of this partner. And we've been doing that for 3 years. People are getting tired from us. They consider us toxic. And we are not even an asset. We are the promissory note. We're debt, which misbehaves and throws tantrums once in a while. If we're talking about reality, they can abandon us and say, you know what, if you're so smart, when you're limiting the languages people can use in your country, when you force them into forced drafting, and while being absolutely immoral in your politics, you appeal to some morality. You know, in this case, these people who have been supporting us for now, till now, they can abandon us and say, well, if you're so smart, go do it the way you see it. End of the first hour.